Does God exist? According to Montaigne. Welcome back to the Summit Study Hall. My name is Dre, and that's the first question we're asking, our first of 6 philosophers for this season. If you followed along with our last 30 episodes, you'll know that this season is all about the Renaissance and some of its most famous thinkers. We'll be exploring, in order, the works of Michel de Montaigne, Thomas Hobbes, René Descartes, Blaise Pascal, Benedict de Spinoza, and John Locke. Our 5 questions remain the same as the previous season, and they are, in order: does God exist? Fate or free will? Why does evil exist? What is beauty? And how does time move? So let's jump right into our first philosopher of the season with a very brief background of his life and writings. Michel de Montaigne was born in 1533 and lived until 1592. His family came from much wealth, and so he was educated very well growing up. He is regarded as the originator of the essay, and while not as respected during his lifetime as he was afterwards, he enjoyed a fair amount of fame. His well-known essays span a wide variety of topics and themes, which were a major influence on many of the later philosophers which we'll study. So let's prepare for another 5 segments of a great thinker as we get into our very first quote. Of all forms, the most beautiful is that of man. Therefore, God must be of that form. No one can be happy without virtue, nor virtue be without reason. And reason cannot inhabit anywhere but in a human shape. God is therefore clothed in a human figure. Essays, Book 2, Chapter 12. The first phrase of this passage attributes a person's appearance to God himself, not just as creator, but the ideal design as well. It is further evident from Genesis 1:27 that God indeed created human beings in his own image. But what about going beyond the physical and looking at the spiritual side of things as well? Are we to believe that we've been given the same spiritual energy which exists in God himself? Perhaps. God may very well have planted within us his very own nature. However, if that be the case, we'd surely need to nurture the seed and help it grow into something more mature and sophisticated than what we're currently born with. Or maybe what we're born with is actually that in its purest form. And as we allow more and more noise from the outside world in, it begins to stain and tarnish that which we need to keep clean. These are deep assumptions, and at the end of the day, that's all they'll remain: assumptions. Until we are ourselves given the chance to traverse from this realm into the next, we are left at a disadvantage when knowing the full spiritual mechanics and makeup of our own souls, and indeed, that of God. Quote number 2. I know not if or not I am wrong. But since, by a particular favor of the divine bounty, a certain form of prayer has been prescribed and dictated to us, word by word, from the mouth of God himself. I have ever been of opinion that we ought to have it in more frequent use than we yet have. And if I were worthy to advise, at the sitting down to and rising from our tables, at our rising from and going to bed, and in every particular action wherein prayer is used, I would that Christians always make use of the Lord's Prayer, if not alone, yet at least always. Essays, Book 1, Chapter 56. This only further solidifies Montaigne's belief in God, as he plainly states that the Lord's Prayer ought to be held in such high esteem that it should be included in many of our day-to-day activities. As is the essayist's wording that the prayer has been given to us from the mouth of God himself. This, amongst the other examples, are clear indications of where he stands on the existence of God. Many have claimed that Montaigne's relationship with the existence of God was complicated. Some have even mentioned him to be an atheist. I, of course, can't speak for him regarding either opinion, but from these passages, it seems clear that whether or not he personally believed in a higher power, he definitely wanted others to believe he did. And that's rarely a subject that's lied about or entirely hidden away without the slightest bit of bias. Either way we look at it, Montaigne seems like a vibrant person who simply wanted his closest friends and family to remember him long after he was no longer to be with us. Towards that end, he became one of the most remembered thinkers of his time. So, according to Montaigne, God absolutely exists. He not only respects and admires God, but also advises that we should heed his words and even pray them as often as the situation calls for. With that, we finish our first installment of this new season. I'm incredibly excited to start another journey down the corridors of time with you and explore what these famous philosophers had to say about very important things. Until tomorrow, my prayers, like always, are for God to bless us all. Indeed. Take care. Fate or free will? According to Montaigne. Welcome to the Summit Study Hall. I'm Dre, and that's the second question of the season, which we're asking the Renaissance thinker today. It'll be a bit shorter in length, as there's only one quote to read and reflect upon, but let's not waste any time and get right into it. Since God foresees that all things shall so fall out, as doubtless he does, it must then necessarily follow that they must so fall out. To which our masters reply, that the seeing anything come to pass as we do, and as God himself also does, for all things being present with him, he rather sees than foresees, is not to compel an event. That is, we see because things do fall out, but things do not fall out because we see. Events cause knowledge, but knowledge does not cause events. That which we see happen does happen, but it might have happened otherwise. And God, in the catalog of the causes of events which he has in his prescience, has also those which we call accidental, and voluntary, depending upon the liberty. He has given our free will and knows that we do amiss because we would do so. Essays, Book 2, Chapter 29. Montaigne's assurance of free will comes from the thought that even though God knows about every action we indeed will do, that still doesn't take away from our choices to do those very actions in the first place. It's almost as if we decide to pick up a book and read, as opposed to ignoring it completely. Though we had the free will to decide either of our two choices, God still knew that we'd choose to pick up the book. This does not negate free will. It simply states that God has prescience over all actions, though they ultimately remain up to us to act out in each of their own corresponding moments of occurrence. That which we see happen does happen, but it might have happened otherwise. This clearly states that there is always another option, another route we could take. Though we're destined, so to speak, for a particular path, it's still our own decision to make. As we have yet to make the decision, it rests in the future. Though from God's point of view, as we'll soon see, it is always the present. Hence, he indeed sees the decision as it's being made. This quote also speaks on the flow of time in regards to God himself, as shown by the phrase, "For all things being present with him, he rather sees than foresees." This indicates Montaigne's view that God is ever present in every tense of time, almost as if he exists outside of time, as we've briefly spoken about before in our previous season. He plainly states that all God has to do in terms of observing an event is to simply look, not to look toward the past nor the future, but simply now. This is the way he operates, with all of the combined moments of time together, individually seen for its own self-merit. So to take all these points and put them together, does Montaigne agree with fate or free will? It would seem as if he agrees with both. This isn't a new concept for us, as we've seen multiple times in the previous season. But he does make it his own by putting it into understandable terms. And with that, we come to the close of this short and succinct installment. I'm always grateful for everyone who listens and comes on these journeys with me. Even if the opinions may very well be wrong or the quotes misunderstood, I'm infinitely glad that I don't feel as if I'm tackling them on my own. So until tomorrow, my prayers, like always, are for God to bless us all. Indeed. Take care. Why does evil exist? According to Montaigne. Welcome to the Summit Study Hall. I'm Dre, and that's the question of the night, which we're asking our philosopher of the moment. As we've seen from past examples, it's a complex question which we may never get the full answer to, but it's an important one all the same. The more we know about why evil exists, the more we may be able to avoid it altogether. So let's get right into it with our first quote. For if evils have no admission into us, but by the judgment we ourselves make of them, it should seem that it is then in our own power to despise them or to turn them to good. If things surrender themselves to our mercy, why do we not convert and accommodate them to our advantage? If what we call evil and torment is neither evil nor torment of itself, but only that our fancy gives it that quality, it is in us to change it, and it being in our own choice, if there be no constraint upon us, we must certainly be very strange fools to take arms for that side which is most offensive to us, and to give sickness, want, and contempt a bitter and nauseous taste, if it be in our power to give them a pleasant relish, and if, fortune simply providing the matter, 'tis for us to give it the form. Now, that what we call evil is not so of itself, or at least to that degree that we make it, and that it depends upon us to give it another taste and complexion, for all comes to one. Let us examine how that can be maintained. Essays, Book 1, Chapter 40. This is Montaigne saying that just because we call something evil, or bad even, it doesn't necessarily have to remain evil or bad. We have the ability to change their moral composition into something much more pleasant and advantageous for our well-being. For example, take the case of swearing out curse words whenever we may find ourselves upset or angry at a situation. Instead of looking at it through the eyes of the act of swearing itself, we could instead hold our anger underneath a microscope and examine where it comes from in the first place. We could use our need to curse as a tool for helping us discover this shortcoming within ourselves, and so continue onward with this choice to fix it at its core. So next time we find that anger taking over, before giving into it and letting it ruin our mood, we instead take a few deep breaths as we remember what originally brought us to this feeling, thus calming down and regaining the ability to put aside cursing entirely. Quote number 2. Life in itself is neither good nor evil. It is the scene of good or evil as you make it. And if you have lived a day, you have seen all. One day is equal and like to all other days. There is no other light, no other shade. This very sun, this moon, these very stars, this very order and disposition of things is the same your ancestors enjoyed, and that shall also entertain your posterity. Essays, Book 1, Chapter 19. This quote can be seen as depressing at first glance. To know that everything that ever will be has already been experienced in a day. That there was nothing which our ancestors saw which we have not seen ourselves. And that there will be nothing new which future generations will see either. But things do change, even if gradually. Technology, social trends, customs and cultures. It all depends on which set of eyes we're looking through. If we ask to see more stars than already in the night sky, we may become disappointed. But if we choose instead to focus on the technology, which allows us to see farther and farther into the universe, we may indeed discover new stars that, though already existed, we hadn't seen before. Perhaps this is where the axiom, the more things change, the more they stay the same, really comes from. This is all to say that Montaigne here appeals for an indifference when thinking about life overall. It cannot be said that it is wholly good nor evil, but it's how we choose to live it that matters. Of course, we can choose to do good things, or we can choose the opposite. But life in itself allows us the decision at the end of the day. Quote number 3. Evil appertains to man, of course. Neither is pain always to be avoided, nor pleasure always pursued. Essays, Book 2, Chapter 12. This final passage is a bit ambiguous. It attributes the quality of evil to humankind, which I think we could all agree with. But it also goes on to say that pain, while not exclusively evil, should not always be avoided, but instead accepted, if not embraced, at certain points in our lives. For instance, the dissolution of a negative relationship. We ought to run toward the sadness rather than away from it. Let it carry out its purpose and be done with it if we're ever to get over the hurt. Consequently, pleasure is not always to be pursued. While again, not exclusively evil, that which we seek is not always the best thing for us either. So with those 3 quotes read and slightly analyzed, we'll wrap this installment up and attribute Montaigne's thoughts on evil as it being a consequence of life overall. Though he says life in itself is neither good nor evil, it can be said that evil comes from the ability to live life on our own terms. And so the responsibility to stray away from it ultimately rests on our own individual shoulders. Thank you again for your continued support. It's more appreciated than I'm able to express here. My hopes are that while even though many of these conclusions we reach seem to be the same, they each have their own angles and explanations. One day in a future season, after we've covered all of our philosophers and eras, we'll recap each question and see our ultimate summation concerning each. Until tomorrow, my prayers, like always, are for God to bless us all. Indeed. Take care. What is beauty? According to Montaigne. Welcome to the Summit Study Hall. I'm Dre, and that's what we'll be diving into today. Beauty is such a complex concept, and nowhere else is that so apparent as in philosophical studies. Let's see what Montaigne himself has to say about it with our first quote. Beauty is a thing of great recommendation in the correspondence amongst men. 'Tis the first means of acquiring the favor and good liking of one another. And no man is so barbarous and morose as not to perceive himself in some sort struck with its attraction. The first distinction that ever was amongst men, and the first consideration that gave some preeminence over others, 'tis likely was the advantage of beauty. Essays, Book 2, Chapter 17. Montaigne seems to be very blunt and clear about the power of beauty itself here. Whether or not he meant it as beauty applied to humankind itself, as opposed to humankind's appreciation for beauty, we'll look into the former and see what that may entail. To think of it in social terms, the beautiful always have an advantage over others, whether it be at a job interview, a first date, or running for office. Those with what society perceives as beautiful traits will undoubtedly have the upper hand. Knowing that one exudes beauty also gives them more confidence in everyday situations, which may in turn make them even more quote unquote beautiful, thereby creating this cycle of self-preservation in some sense. It may be an unfair reality, but it seems that it's how the world's worked for ages past and how it'll work in the ages to come. This also brings up the question of why society deems certain traits as more appealing than others. Where did those certain trends come from, and who was the first to decide them? Further, each culture has their own definitions of beauty and what their individual societies see as attractive. It's an interesting thought and one which we'll explore more in depth with later thinkers. Quote number 2. The beautiful souls are they that are universal, open, and ready for all things. If not instructed, at least capable of being so. Essays, Book 2, Chapter 17. This truly captures what Montaigne's ideal version of having a beautiful soul entails. One that is accepting of anything and everything, and if not, is willing to learn how to be. That may take the shape of learning new knowledge, experiencing new things, or even attaining new levels of personal freedom, in the sense that the more we know about ourselves, the more ease we have to be who we were created to be. It's almost like taking a photograph. The more light the lens can capture, the clearer the photograph will be. Attributing self-knowledge to that very light, we can then become clearer examples of our own true inner selves. I imagine his message here is that if one looks to become a beautiful soul themselves, they shouldn't ever close themselves off to new experiences, feelings, or wonder. That's when we stop learning as individuals. The truly beautiful keep their minds open, their hearts open, and their willingness to experience as many things as possible. Quote number 3. The least forced and most natural motions of the soul are the most beautiful. The best employments those that are least strained. Essays, Book 3, Chapter 3. When we can easily move through the situations and circumstances which life throws at us with a certain amount of ease and stay fluid throughout any hardship, that's when we'll truly know that we're ready for future levels. This, I think, is what Montaigne was trying to convey with this passage. It seems to relate to the previous quote in some ways, as they both speak on the qualities of what something beautiful may entail. To put them together, one can say that the more we learn about ourselves and allow ourselves the ability to be organic, the easier it'll be for us to move through individual moments with that much more fluidity. Hence, becoming a near perfect picture of pure beauty itself. It seems that when we're forcing things out of our character, which never originally belonged there to begin with, that's when we're working against the flow of our organic selves. But when we keep to our true nature, that's a beautiful thing in and of itself. What can we say is Montaigne's ultimate summation concerning beauty? Perhaps it's staying true to oneself, which in turn means becoming the person we've all been individually created to be. The closer we can get to that image in our minds of who we know and feel that we truly are, the more beautiful we will become, both inside and out. So with that, we come to the end of today's installment. Beauty as an idea is always an extremely fascinating topic, and we're sure to learn more about it as the eras we cover get closer and closer to present day. But until our next philosopher's definition of it, we can just say that it'll remain a mystery in some sense as to what, if anything, is wholly beautiful and nothing else but. Until tomorrow, my prayers, like always, are for God to bless us all. Indeed. Take care. How does time move? According to Montaigne. Welcome to the Summit Study Hall. My name is Dre, and that's exactly what we'll be looking into today for our final question concerning Montaigne's thoughts and opinions. We won't waste any time, so let's jump right into it with our first quote. Such as accuse mankind of the folly of gaping after future things, and advise us to make our benefit of those which are present, and to set up our rest upon them, as having no grasp upon that which is to come, even less than that which we have upon what is past, have hit upon the most universal of human errors, if that may be called an error to which nature herself has disposed us, in order to the continuation of her own work, prepossessing us, amongst several others, with this deceiving imagination, as being more jealous of our action than afraid of our knowledge. We are never present with, but always beyond ourselves. Fear, desire, hope still push us on towards the future, depriving us, in the meantime, of the sense and consideration of that which is to amuse us with the thought of what shall be, even when we shall be no more. Essays, Book 1, Chapter 3. I may only grasp a slight bit of this loaded quote, but from what I do understand, it seems that Montaigne is advocating for a life lived in the present. To constantly be looking forward with our attentions firmly fixed on the future is quite literally to let the present pass us by. Those things which drive our moments from one to the next, such as fear, desire, hope, and so many more emotions, make living in the immediate present a near impossible feat. But if we are to enjoy everything we do desire and hope for, we have to take those moments of solitude and reflect upon our journey so that we don't wake up when it's too late to turn back the clock. I believe this also speaks on how useless it truly is to concentrate on what shall be, because from our vantage points, we can never really be sure. To focus on either this or that while trying to take the best course of action is usually a lost cause, which is probably why living in the here and now is such a popular idea these days. Perhaps people are finally fed up with the uncertainty of an unforeseeable future and have finally decided that the only way to live is one moment at a time. Quote number 2. That which is eternal, that is to say, that never had beginning, nor never shall have ending, and to which time can bring no mutation. For time is a mobile thing, and that appears as in a shadow, with a matter ever more flowing and running, without ever remaining stable and permanent, and to which belong those words, before and after, has been or shall be, which at the first sight evidently show that it is not a thing that is, for it were a great folly and a manifest falsity to say that that is which is not yet being, or that has already ceased to be. And as to these words, present, instant, and now, by which it seems that we principally support and found the intelligence of time, reason, discovering, does presently destroy it, for it immediately divides and splits it into the future and past, being of necessity to consider it divided in two. The same happens to nature that is measured as to time that measures it, for she has nothing more subsisting and permanent than the other. But all things are either born, bearing, or dying, so that it were sinful to say of God, who is he only who is, that he was, or that he shall be. For those are terms of declension, transmutation, and vicissitude, of which cannot continue or remain in being. Wherefore, we are to conclude that God alone is, not according to any measure of time, but according to an immutable and an immovable eternity, not measured by time, nor subject to any declension, before whom nothing was, and after whom nothing shall be, either more new or more recent, but a real being, that with one soul now fills the forever, and that there is nothing that truly is but he alone, without our being able to say, he has been or shall be, without beginning and without end. Essays, Book 2, Chapter 12. Again, while I strive almost in vain to decipher most of this quote, what I can gather is very important and poetically put. The most compelling idea here is that God is not bound to the limits of time nor entropy itself. He does not wither away nor lose any of his glory as time passes by, because he exists outside of its hold. Montaigne further describes God's divinity by saying how there was nothing before him, as there will be nothing after him. He is indeed without beginning and without end. Further into this idea, we can look at time in two different ways from our limited vantage points. We can attribute the titles past, present, and future to certain events, or just say that they happened before or after a specific instance. God, on the other hand, is always there. As we discussed in our fate or free will installment, God quite literally exists in all tenses of time, in all eras, and in all of humankind's history, past and future. Once it inevitably dissolves away into nothingness, we will probably be given the ability to witness what existence without the limitations of time truly entails. Until then, we are stuck living one day, one moment, and indeed one instance at a time. With these two quotes, we find more of Montaigne's opinions regarding God and humankind's perception of time, more so than a solid answer as to its movement. Whether all of time happens throughout a span or in a blink of an eye, we can be sure that while we're still here in this realm, time, from our perspective, as it stands, will never change its flow. So that'll do it as to Montaigne's interesting thoughts on our 5 main questions. Tomorrow, we begin to tackle Thomas Hobbes and his ideas on these fascinating topics. Until then, my prayers, like always, are for God to bless us all. Indeed, take care.